In this video, I'm going to talk about conditioning and learning, and we're going to talk about classical conditioning primarily. And then we'll talk about in other videos, we're going to talk about operant conditioning, and then we'll also talk about observational learning. So what is learning? So a lot of times we think of learning as reading books and taking tests and doing experiments, but we also learn from experiences as well, right? We learn from punishments and rewards and lots of other things too, which we'll talk about in this chapter. So learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or thinking that results from experience. So it's not exactly what we think of when we think of learning. So behaviorism was the primary field of psychology that really studied these principles of learning. Behaviorism, as you remember, that believed that all of our behaviors are controlled by environmental factors and that our emotions and our internal thoughts are not important to understanding behavior and that we should only focus on observable behaviors and we shouldn't be trying to understand thoughts and emotion because we can't possibly understand those. So we do absolutely learn through our interaction with our environment, and our behavior can definitely be controlled by factors in our environment, things like punishments and rewards, and also conditioning and learning that we'll talk about. There's a whole field called behavior analysis or behavior analyst. You can get a master's degree in this, you can get a doctoral degree in this. And what they really understand behavioral principles and apply these behavioral principles to working with children with autism, different schools with developmental disabilities, many different settings as well. So these behavioral skills, even though we don't like to think about the fact that we can be controlled, they actually are really useful in helping control behavior in lots of different situations. We do have a program here at GCC called the Developmental Specialist Certificate, I believe. There's a video included in all the videos, I think it's the last video, that talks about the program and what you need to do for that program. It's really about 4 psychology classes, and one of those classes is Psych 101, one of them is developmental, one of them is behavior analysis, I believe, understanding behavior. And then there's an internship that actually help you get a job working in this field using behavioral skills. So even though it's an older theory, it's still a really effective and useful theory as well. So John B. Watson, the guy that did you guys haven't seen, we haven't talked about the Little Albert study, is known as the father of behaviorism. And he really studied primarily classical conditioning that we'll talk about. So how does learning occur? So there's 3 different types of learning that we're going to talk about. So classical conditioning is really just learning to associate things with each other. So we tend to put things together that happen together. And Ivan Pavlov and Pavlov's dog are the main theorists in this area of classical conditioning, but classical conditioning is something that's used in advertising. It's something that we're all really familiar with, so we'll talk a lot about that. Operant conditioning is learning based on rewards and punishments. So we learn to connect behaviors with their consequences, both positive and negative, and we're certainly more motivated to do something that has a positive consequences versus a negative consequence. B.F. Skinner was one of the major psychologists in this area in the 1950s and 60s, and he actually studied pigeons and mice. And he came up with the idea that it's not necessary to reinforce a behavior every time, and sometimes it's actually more effective to just reinforce it part of the time. So we'll talk about that later on. And then the third way we learn things is through observation or observational learning. So Albert Bandura is one of the main figures in this area, and he says learning occurs by watching and imitating others. And we'll talk a little bit about violence in the media and whether or not people actually imitate violence and is that a good thing. I have a video on GTA that we won't be able to watch. I'll try to post it for you. But there are a lot of psychologists and a lot of people that want to prove that violent video games cause people to be violent. And actually, there has been inconclusive evidence about that, but we'll talk about that later. So classical conditioning is the first thing we're going to talk about, and it's learning based on making associations between things. So Corona Beer here is trying to associate their product with the ocean and relaxing and having a good time. And it's pretty hard to really think about Corona without thinking about the beach because we've seen so many commercials. We also have lots of different associations. If you're a person that has different ringtones for different people, you have different associations with each of those rings. So we learn to put things together that happen together that we put together even. So we understand that different cell phone rings are associated with certain things and certain people, and we have a certain response to that. If our boss is sending us a message on our cell phone and we're getting a particular ring for that, we know they're probably wanting us to come into work, and we have a response. We maybe don't want to do that. And or if it's somebody we really want to hear from, our boyfriend, girlfriend, we have a much more positive response to that. So we have a conditioned response to each of those rings. So we also have a conditioned response or association with all of these symbols I'm going to put up here. We know what all of these symbols mean because they've been associated with their product or thing. This is the Olympics here. So many times we've seen all of these things put together, and so we know what they mean. And we see just the symbol, and it brings up all the idea about their particular product, positive or negative. Um, Manufacturers, advertisers are constantly trying to pair their products with stuff that they think we're going to like. So here they're saying Wheaties is going to make you healthy. Going to make you healthy and strong. You're going to be a champion if you eat Wheaties, right? Well, that's probably not necessarily true. If you drink Gatorade, and I know this is a really old commercial here, and old symbol for Gatorade, but they're saying you're going to be like Michael Jordan if you drink Gatorade. And now we all know that that's not true, but we're more attracted to these products because of their association with different products and sometimes with different celebrities. So let's talk about Ivan Pavlov. So sometimes classical conditioning is also called Pavlovian conditioning, and it's because it was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, and he was actually a Russian physiologist who studied the digestive system in the 1890s. He was not a psychologist. He was not trying to really understand classical conditioning. He was really trying to understand digestion in dogs, and he accidentally discovered classical conditioning through his work studying digestion in dogs. So he had this contraption set up here, and he had the dog hooked up to this tube here that measured the dog's saliva, how much the dog salivated. And so he would measure that. And what he would do is present the dog with food, and then he'd measure how much the dog salivated. And I guess salivation is related to digestion as well. But pretty soon he started to notice that as soon as he walked into the room, the dog actually started salivating. Hadn't even gotten the food out or anything yet, and the dog was salivating. So pretty quickly after Pavlov gave the dog food a few times, the dog started to associate Pavlov alone with food. And so it started salivating as soon as it saw Pavlov. So Pavlov thought, this is very interesting. Maybe I could pair something else with the food and get the dog to respond to that as well. So right now the dog is responding to Pavlov, but let's try something else. So he picked something that a dog would have no particular response to. So he picked a bell. So you ring a bell in front of a dog, they look at you like, what? What do you want? What's the deal? So they have a neutral response. They don't necessarily have a response to that. But what he started to do was he would ring that bell before he came into the room and when he gave the dog the food. And pretty soon the dog connected that bell with the food, and he was able to show that he was able to condition the dog to respond to the bell. So pretty soon all he had to do was ring the bell and the dog started to salivate. So that's how classical conditioning can occur. So this is a real formal experiment to prove that classical conditioning actually occurs. So what Pavlov did, he took a neutral stimulus that the dog doesn't have any particular response to. He paired that with the food, and the dog has an unconditioned response to food. We all have an unconditioned response. We actually all salivate towards food. So we don't have to be conditioned to like food or to respond to food. So food is an unconditioned stimulus, and our unconditioned response to food is to salivate. So he was pairing that neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, something we don't need to be conditioned to like. So just like that Corona beer was trying to show us the beach and relaxation, we don't have to be conditioned to like the beach or relaxation. And if we pair that with a product, then that product now produces that feeling. And that's what Pavlov was doing here as well. So he presented the dog the food, rang the bell, and pretty soon the dog started to associate that bell with the food. And this is called the I can't even say it, acquisition phase. So this is where we're training. And acquisition might mean like training. So this is where the dog is actually acquiring this conditioned response. So during conditioning, he's pairing the two things together. Then after conditioning, all he has to do is ring the bell, and he gets the conditioned response of the dog salivating, as if that bell was actually food. So the dog responds to the bell in exactly the same way as it would to real food. So that's classical conditioning. So the dog's responding to something that it never would have responded to before because they were paired together. So these are terms that you need to remember for the quiz. Unconditioned stimulus means it doesn't need to be conditioned, actually. It's something that we have a natural response to, so that it automatically triggers an involuntary response without any learning needed. An unconditioned response is also an untrained response. So it's a reflexive and involuntary response to an unconditioned stimulus. So we naturally salivate to food. There's no training involved there. Whereas conditioned, think of it as being trained. So a conditioned stimulus is something we have to be trained to respond to. So this could be an advertiser's product, a new product. Or something neutral like a bell or a buzzer. So, and if you think about the cell phone rings that you have on your phone, until you connected that particular ring to a particular person, you didn't have a particular response to that cell phone ring. But now that you've connected it to that person, it's now a conditioned stimulus. You now respond to it just like you would that particular person. And then your conditioned response is your learned response to that conditioned stimulus. So salivating to a bell. So something that you wouldn't ever respond to if you hadn't been conditioned. So Pavlov, through this experiment, proved that we learn through classical conditioning. Now, we would never do this as an experiment today. We don't need to do it because it's already been proven that we actually learn to associate things together, that classical conditioning is definitely real. So advertisers use classical conditioning all the time to associate their products with things that they think we're going to like. So these are natural unconditioned stimuli to create a conditioned response. So we already talked about Corona a bunch, but how about the most interesting guy in the world here? So what they're trying to say is that if you drink Dos Equis, you're going to be sophisticated and smart and interesting, right? And who doesn't want to be that, right? So those are all natural unconditioned stimuli, being smart, being respected. And so they're trying to pair their beer with that. And here's some other examples of things that we don't have to be trained to have a response to. So fear at something really scary, we have a natural response to that. We don't need to be trained to be scared of this bear or this shark. We know it. We don't necessarily need to be trained to like particular food, but some of us may like different foods, and that's okay. But we'll have an unconditioned response to food. Also, scary sounds, scary faces, loud sounds, we have an unconditioned response to that. Usually it's a fearful response. these are all things that we really shouldn't have any particular response to. And the only reason that we do have a response to them is because we connect them to the products that they're selling or to the commercial that we saw, whether we like them or don't like them. But they would be totally meaningless. Maybe somebody from another country that maybe comes over here and has never been to Chick-fil-A might not have any clue as to what this is here. And so those are things that we have to be trained to know what they connect to and whether we like them or not. So there are other examples here as well. So a lot of times advertisers will try to pair a celebrity with their product. And so we have usually some kind of a response to a particular celebrity. And so, if we saw this perfume in a brown paper bag and we couldn't tell it was Beyonce's perfume, we would have kind of a neutral response, or we'd like it based on whether we like this particular smell of perfume or not. But because we know it's Beyonce's perfume, if we like Beyonce, we probably are more likely to like her perfume, and vice versa. If we don't like her, we might be likely not to like her perfume. So taste aversion is an interesting example of classical conditioning. If you've ever had food poisoning, it's a horrible experience, but typically you relate wherever it was that you ate at. You think about what could I have possibly eaten, and when you realize what it was, you want to avoid that food, so that you don't get sick again. So, if you get sick, you go to your favorite Chinese buffet and you get sick, that thing that you used to really love has now become negative, right? You're like, I don't want to eat there again. So the unconditioned stimulus was that food that you loved, that restaurant that you loved, but it's now been conditioned because it's paired with getting sick. So your unconditioned response is, I don't want to go there, I don't want to get sick. So that's your conditioned response. So phobias are also created through classical conditioning. If you have ever been bitten by a dog, you might begin to fear all dogs. Usually phobias happen when people are really young. So if you were 5 years old or something and you got bit by a dog, you might spend your whole lifetime being fearful of dogs. If you don't get help, you can actually get help for that. Because the dog was a neutral stimulus at first, but once you got bitten, you start to realize, oh, dogs can be dangerous, and you might start to fear all dogs. So what was once a neutral stimulus is now a conditioned stimulus, because you got bitten. So a dog is now a conditioned stimulus. So this is a famous experiment in psychology, and kind of a sad experiment, really. And it's used a lot as a really unethical experiment, an example of how we really didn't think about ethical things and mistreatment of children. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. It was done in 1920, and it was done by John B. Watson, the father of behaviorism, and Rosalie Rayner was like one of his graduate assistants, and I can't remember what university it was now. But he wanted to prove that he could classically condition a child, to fear furry animals. And so what they did was they paired a loud, scary sound. I think they took two heavy pots or pans and banged them together right behind this poor little boy whenever they presented him with a cute little furry animal. And pretty soon he became fearful of anything remotely furry. So this is little Albert here in the middle, and I'll show you the next slide here. At first they just presented him with these cute little furry animals, and little kids are generally interested in furry animals, wanting to play with them, all of that. But as soon as he started to reach out for these furry little animals, they'd scare him to death with this horrible sound. And pretty quickly, the poor little child had no interest in furry animals at all, and was really afraid, and really wanted to crawl and get away from the animals, because it didn't want to hear that horrible sound. So in this experiment, the unconditioned stimulus is this loud banging sound. We're all fearful. We don't need to be trained that that's a scary sound or a dangerous sound. And our unconditioned response is fear. So in this case, Watson was conditioning poor little Albert to be fearful of furry animals. And now his conditioned response is to be afraid of furry animals. So really, really sad. So little Albert here was about 18 months, oh, it says 9 months old at the time of the experiment. And he became fearful of all animals, and he was even afraid of Santa Claus. Unfortunately, we didn't get to really see how this impacted him throughout his whole lifetime, but I think it definitely could have impacted him for his whole lifetime. Probably could have been phobic about anything furry. But unfortunately, he died at the age of 6 of hydrocephalus, totally unrelated to the experiment. Um, but today we would never do this experiment, because do you think this could have been harmful to little Albert? Yes, definitely. And his mom was actually a nurse at the university hospital there, and they were advertising for, children to be used in different experiments. And I think the expectation was that they would take care of this child, but um, they didn't really explain the specifics of the experiment to the mom, and they paid the mom like $1 a day or something for poor little Albert here to be conditioned to be scared to death of animals. Pretty sad. So, this is an experiment that's often used as an example of unethical behavior by psychologists. And so sometimes we don't even talk about it. But Watson's whole purpose here was to just prove that we could classically condition people, which we can. Classical conditioning occurs naturally without studying or voluntary effort. We know what all those symbols mean on the bottom, and we learned those pretty quickly. Probably saw them once or twice, and that's all we needed. We know what they are, we know what they mean. So we put things together naturally without any particular effort or studying. We learn to associate things together. And sometimes it takes repeated pairings, but sometimes it's pretty quick as well. So I wanted to talk about a few concepts of conditioning. So stimulus generalization is a tendency to respond to stimuli that are similar but not identical to the conditioned stimulus. So poor little Albert here was conditioned, and they used different animals. They used rabbits, and they used a monkey and a dog, and here's a rabbit. But he generalized that anything furry was going to be scary. So that's stimulus generalization. If you burn yourself with a match, you learn to avoid flames and fire and things like that. If you get bitten by a dog, you might learn to fear all dogs, or you might do what we call stimulus discrimination, and you might be only fearful of big dogs or of certain breeds of dogs. That's stimulus discrimination. So you learn that you can respond differently to the stimuli that are similar. So we can discriminate between that cell phone ring on TV, although that's kind of difficult sometimes, or a doorbell on the house versus the doorbell on the television. And then we might learn to just only fear certain types of dogs or certain breeds of dog. Extinction is another term that we use in conditioning, and what it means is if you don't continue to reinforce a behavior or continue to associate things together with classical conditioning, eventually they go extinct. They go away, just like the dinosaurs. That's why I put that picture there. So if Pavlov kept ringing that bell and stopped bringing the dog food, eventually the dog would just decide that the food doesn't exist anymore. So if you continue to present that conditioned stimulus and you don't give them the unconditioned stimulus or the food, that association eventually goes away and disappears. And that's extinction. Spontaneous recovery, I think, is the final one here. If the conditioned stimulus is reintroduced after it's been extinct, so if Pavlov stopped giving the dog the food but kept ringing that bell, then all of a sudden started to bring the dog food and ring the bell again, that response would come back more quickly. So we'd learn it much more quickly. And that is it. Oh, we got 2 scenarios to do. Okay, so this is a classical conditioning scenario, and you're going to be asked to do this on your homework assignment, and there definitely are some questions on the quiz about understanding what an unconditioned stimulus is, an unconditioned response, conditioned and conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. So here's a scenario. Every time Sally opens her kitchen cupboard that has the dog treats in it, her dog Spot gets really excited. But he doesn't get excited when she opens the other cupboards in the kitchen, I can't speak. So what's the unconditioned stimulus? The thing the dog doesn't need to be conditioned to like. Of course, that would be the dog treats. The unconditioned response to dog treats for him is about excitement about eating and salivating. The conditioned stimulus is what now? It's actually that kitchen cupboard. And it's actually that specific kitchen cupboard because you said Spot doesn't get excited when she goes to other drawers in the kitchen or other cupboards in the kitchen. So the specific kitchen cupboard where she keeps those treats is the conditioned stimulus. And the conditioned response is to get excited about food and to start salivating in anticipation of getting that food. What about generalization or discrimination? Does that apply here? And actually, it does. So this dog is actually, Spot here is pretty discriminating. He recognizes that it's only this one specific cupboard that his food is in. If he generalized, he would think anytime she went to the kitchen and opened a cupboard, it would be time for him to eat. So here's another example. David had a painful experience at the dentist office when he was a child. Even as an adult, he still is very anxious about going to the dentist. So the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that we have a natural response to is what? It's actually pain. And our unconditioned response to pain is fear or feeling pain. The conditioned stimulus is now what? What is he fearful of now? It's the dentist. And his conditioned response now is feeling really anxious. And he's now associated that dentist with pain. Does generalization or discrimination apply here? And actually, generalization applies here because David has decided that every time he goes to the dentist, it's now going to be painful. So he's generalized that all dentists and anytime he goes to the dentist is going to be painful. And we know sometimes you go to the dentist and you're getting your teeth cleaned in general, it's not too painful of an experience. If you go to a new dentist, you might have some concerns. And then discrimination, we can discriminate. So we discriminate that, oh, it's just going to be a cleaning.